In the early 2000s, when sanctions were first placed on Iran and there was a stable, happier population, patience wore thin enough for them to be willing to enter into a nuclear deal in 2015, 10 years after that country was stripped bare. 4 years now into that nuclear deal failing, that patience has again worn thin. Iran ought re-enter that nuclear deal to save its people, to make those leaders happy. What am I going to do in this speech? I will first talk about the context and the relevant interests of the Iranian leadership. Secondly, I'll talk about the broader economic benefits. And finally, I will talk about the broader political interests that this serves. Firstly, on context, there are actually three key things to note here. The first is to note that Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal in a very hyper-politicized way. However, since then, there has been a regime change in the US, and Biden has shown interest in rejoining by virtue of talking with the Iranian leaders in 2021. Biden was Obama's VP. This was an Obama policy that happened in 2015. He was very keen to reinstate this. What this means is that the conditions that have been offered to Iran in rejoining the nuclear deal have been overwhelmingly positive for them, right? Because in exchange for scaling back your uranium enrichment program, you have been offered gradual releasing of trade sanctions, gradual releasing of the personal sanctions, right? It is going to be a favorable deal for you to engage with. That is not something that this negative team can claim that it will be unfavorable. Biden is keen to fix up the stuff up of the Trump administration. Biden is keen to minimize their liabilities right now in a context where you have things like China and Russia, meaning that it is increasingly geopolitically unstable. You also don't want Iran to ally with China and join things like the Belt and Road Initiative and engage in even more trade with them. That is why these terms are very likely to be favorable. Secondly, on context, the leadership of Iran currently is incredibly hardline and a conservative Islamist government led by Khamenei, who has a son who has been trying to instill as his successor on debt. But this is being challenged by a progressive, westernized political movement. Thirdly, on context, the sanctions that have arisen out of Iran pulling out of the nuclear deal have hit them hard because it looks like trade sanctions. That means that families cannot put rice on their children's tables, but it also looks like personal sanctions where Iran's political leadership is unable to access any of the houses, any of the assets that they own overseas held by the US. This was several hundreds of billions of dollars, $100 billion, our matter file informs us. This was a lot of money, not something that you were willing to forego, right? The vast majority of this happened as a result of pissing Trump off. What then were the interests of this Iranian government? They were twofold. Firstly, you want a personal thing on behalf of the Supreme Leader Khamenei. He wants himself to succeed and continue his leadership, but he wants to install his son Mushtaba. But secondly, you have broader national interests. And this isn't only a thing of, affecting the people in terms of, their crippled economy, the immense food insecurity, the COVID-19 outbreaks. Insulating yourself from these things is not something that you can do forever, because the longer patience wears thin, the more you expose yourself to things like civil unrest, but also you yourself cannot get access to things like food, right? Note, a few decades ago when the sanctions were first applied, you had $600 billion in reserves in Iran. That has now decreased to 20% of what it initially was. That number is continuing to decrease. You needed to up those reserves. What then were the immense economic benefits of rejoining the nuclear deal? They are twofold. Firstly, in terms of personal benefits, we note that there is a personal interest that you get in terms of economics if you are to rejoin this deal, right? Because to the extent that if Iran re-enters and scales back their uranium enrichment program for the purposes of their nuclear weapons, the US has promised that they will gradually unfreeze all of these assets in exchange for a rollback of nuclear enrichment. That means that the leadership in this debate have access to their personal assets, have access to all of that money, right? That means that you can insulate yourself from that civil unrest and protect yourself from ever being overthrown, right? Because to a certain extent, you're willing to sacrifice your ideology if that is what this team wants to run, if it is something that leads you to staying in that power. That was a trade-off that you make, and having access to your personal assets means you can pay for a military, pay for security, pay to relocate if you really need to save your life, and just pay for the goods that you use every single day. That was an immense personal benefit. Secondly, it is very good for the country's broader economic interests, right? Because firstly, to the extent that at the moment that sanctions are lifted, the Iran rial will simply just accelerate in its foreign exchange value, right? Because since the nuclear deal has been fallen through, at least 90% of its value against the US dollar has decreased. This instantly improves the moment that global investors are once again willing to engage with your country, right? And the impact of this is threefold. Firstly, the cash reserves in the country increase in worth by whatever amount the value of the Iranian rial increases by. Secondly, you are now able to access global trade markets because you have purchasing power as a government. Your people also have purchasing power through their currencies. They get access to lots of overseas goods that they are now starved of. You get food on those people's plates. But thirdly, the assets of ordinary citizens also increase in value panel because of the fact that these are oftentimes held in the rial and not in US dollars in the same way the personal assets of leaders are held in. You needed a good value of the rial in order for the middle class to be able to access what they currently hold. The second way in which you approve the broader economic interest is because of the fact that you lift those trade sanctions, as I tell you, as has been a Biden promise. It allows you to trade with the rest of the West, because when the US sanctions you, it is not just the US that sanctions you, it is every single ally that they possess, it is every single country that does not want to be invaded. They are the ones sanctioning you. You automatically gain access to all of those markets, right? Because you remove yourself from that Western dogpile, you now get things like grain, you now get things like rice, you now get things like export industries that have flatlined as a result of that government, right? If the negative team wants to say that these terms will be unfavorable, and it's not going to be very good for Iranian oil reserves. Guess what? The US wants a whole bunch right now because petrol is $6 a gallon. Oil. They're just going to accept those things. You have a huge amount of bargaining power in this. You have a huge amount of power to make sure that those terms are something that they abide by. But even if the terms are not ideal, your people are suffering so much right now. So even some level of compromise terms is a good thing. I'm going to finish this speech by talking about the broader political interest, because even if you were not convinced that we win this debate simply on the fact that the rich people in Iran are able to now gain access to their personal assets and that they are able to insulate themselves from, all of the economic unrest that happens in this country, you also have an immense political interest in bettering and re-entering the Iran nuclear deal, right? Note that all that I tell you in setup about the instability caused by the progressive wing of Iranian politics, right? That is a movement that is allying themselves with the West. That is a movement that has promised to rejoin the nuclear deal in order to peel back those sanctions. Promised to peel back those sanctions. What do you do in terms of politics? Firstly, note that you are at active risk of being overthrown if sanctions continue. There is an immense amount of civil unrest, and sanctions embolden that progressive wing who says they will cooperate. And to the extent that you want your son Mushtaba to be the next leader of Iran to succeed you, how do you get that? You get that by appealing to those people. Why is that? It is because whoever cooperates with the West first in this debate has a first mover advantage. That is to say that if the current Iranian government is to go and engage with the West in the way that it does, right, and cooperate with them, they are going to stay in power for a very, very long time, because the US has a marked history of propping up leaders who give them access to things like oil and leaders who cooperate with them in exchange for things like natural resources. At the end of this speech, what do I prove to you? I prove to you that Iran ought rejoin the nuclear deal because of the fact that it is going to be very, very good for that leadership if they are one that is self-interested. If they are one that cares for that broader national interest, they want to feed their people, they want to do good by them. If they are one that is going to want to keep their son in power, they also do that. All of the interests are so much more accounted for if you rejoin that nuclear deal. You are willing to sacrifice your ideology in this debate. Never prouder to affirm.
The Iranian leadership has extremely legitimate reasons to fear the United States and the Sunni bloc in the region. They are a highly ideological, totalitarian state with many legitimate conflicts in their region and with the West, and hence they have an intense and immense incentive to become a nuclear power. Side Negative is the only team in this debate that gets Iran nuclear weapons, which is a precondition for a century of national security and power projection for Iran. If sanctions from nations you have little incentives to be close to and from which you gain very little, and the loss of access to personal offshore assets is the trade-off that the affirmative team wants us to make in this debate, we will always make that trade-off. I'm going to do three things in this speech. The first thing I'm going to do is establish the incentives that we believe the Iranian leadership prioritizes. Second thing I'm going to do is explain why our world is the only world in which Iran is able to develop nuclear weapons, and then explain why this is the only world in which Iran's central interests are met. And finally, I'm going to explain why sanctions are unlikely to bother Iran particularly greatly. Okay, first then on the incentives of Iran's leadership. The first thing to say and to establish is that Iran is a highly ideologically motivated power. They are motivated by a particular interpretation of Shia Islam. They believe in the dominance of this form of Islam. They have centuries of conflicts that suggest to you that this is a strong incentive that they have. They are led by essentially a religious leader. They are totalitarian. This establishes that they are highly ideologically motivated. Secondly, they have a very legitimate desire to protect themselves from the West, and specifically the United States of America. We would say that this is quite a genuine interest because the US has historically meddled in the politics of Iran. They've done things like privatize Iranian assets and selling them off to US corporations. That is an extremely legitimate reason to distrust the US, and they would take extreme measures to protect themselves from the influence of the US. So if we're able to establish that we curb US influence in Iran, we can get up in this debate. Finally, we would say that they seek some degree of regional influence. Why would you believe this is true? They are currently engaged in a set of proxy conflicts in the Persian Gulf with Saudi Arabia that leads a Sunni Islamic bloc. They desire to be regionally dominant, they desire to defeat this bloc, so if we are the team that establishes that they can get that regional influence, we will be the team that wins this debate. Okay, let's talk about why Iran will only develop nuclear weapons in the world of team negative. So, the first part of this argument is to establish why they will be able to if they continue on their current path and do not join the Iran nuclear deal. The first reason that we think this is true, they are currently very close to doing so. They have a strong nuclear program. They have the facilities to do this. The reason for the deal in the first place was that the West and the US had an extreme fear of Iran gaining nuclear weapons imminently. That suggests to you they're close. Secondly, they are currently supported by Russia, which is a major nuclear power in the world that seeks its own regional influence, that supports Iran, that helps it with its nuclear capabilities. Thirdly, nuclear proliferation and the gaining of nuclear weapons is actually not very technologically difficult. We understand the basic science of it. Many countries have already developed nuclear weapons before. It is extremely precedented to have them. The major constraint then is a political one and an economic one. And these are the exact things that the Iran nuclear deal constrains. Okay, now that that's established, why is it that specifically the case that the Iran nuclear deal is the thing that stopped Iran from establishing nuclear weapons, and if they rejoined it, they would not be able to get them? The first and most obvious reason is they have to abide by conditions that restrict their ability to enrich uranium, things that are necessary for nuclear weapons. It's necessary, obviously, also for the benefits of Team Affirmative to accrue, for you to accept the terms of the Joint Progressive JCPOA. I don't know what the words actually are, sorry. To agree to things like oversight. For instance, you need to accept that your programs will be overviewed by the US. So you will have to actually abide by the deal and stop your development of nuclear weapons if you do this. Secondly, the Iran nuclear deal inhibits your ability to operate on international markets which provide you the resources that are necessary for the establishment of nuclear weapons, things like enriched uranium. This disables you from obtaining the goods that you necessarily need. And thirdly, you have to restrict yourself by the terms of the deal. The upshot of this argument is to establish that only in our world Iran accesses nuclear weapons. Why then would you believe that this is an important argument in the debate, and in fact, the biggest impact? The first is it is a significant way by which Iran can establish its long-term regional security. They have an extremely powerful powerful incentive to oppose the United States. There are the Western powers who are known to intervene into Iranian politics. These countries are now not able to do this because the risk of a nuclear conflict is so high that any level of meddling, any level of economic and political conflict with Iran would lead to an untold disaster. That means those countries preemptively do not attack Iran. That also applies to the Sunni bloc like Saudi Arabia, the regional conflicts and the proxy conflicts that Iran is currently engaged with in its quest for ideological dominance. There is no threat to Iran and its territory and its allies insofar as it now has a nuclear proliferation. The claim here is that there is essentially a credible reason to protect security, and this is the only way that you can do it. The second thing to say here is that Iran is particularly interested in its own power projection. So nations are now very likely to be afraid of Iran. You can do things like doing prominent nuclear tests, showing how far your nuclear weapons can travel. This is good in and of itself because the leadership of Iran believe that it should be a power with immense global influence, that its ideology and its religion should predominate in the world. Insofar as you believe this is an important incentive of Iran, you ought to believe that Iran can only get this when they can power project on nuclear weapons. Thirdly, they probably are now able to use the fear of nuclear weapons to extort some nations. So look at countries like North Korea, which have essentially gone rogue on the question of nuclear weapons. When they do big nuclear tests, when they power project with their nuclear program, program, they're able to bring countries to the table to give them foreign aid. They're able to bring countries to the table to lift particular sanctions. We think if Iran is able to actually develop nuclear weapons, we're able to successfully co-opt and flip the economic harms of Team Affirmative by saying simply, you can extort countries to lifting sanctions off you. Additionally, we would say this is probably bad for the Iranian image if you don't do this, if you rejoin the deal, because you're probably seen as weak domestically, because there is a huge ideological opposition domestically to the United States, especially after the US left the deal, even though Iran was abiding by it, and the huge part of Iranian politics is essentially distrust of the US. You are seen as weak, you are seen as cozying up to the US if you do this. This reduces your power as a regime. That all establishes that nuclear weapons and getting them is a big benefit for Team Negative in the debate, and we're the only one who gets it. Finally, at the end of this speech, I want to explain why lifting of economic sanctions is not a particularly substantive incentive of the Iranian leadership. The first thing is, this is the thing they care about the least. They would willingly trade this off with their ability to power project, to exert regional national security dominance for over a century, given that they are highly ideologically motivated. Secondly, the sanctions primarily they're not all personal, they primarily affect Iran's poorest people. This actually benefits the leadership because people are less likely to oppose you when they are poor and destitute. And thirdly, the US does not have substantial trade incentives to go with the West anyway. They still will likely heavily distrust them. And Russia, which is a major ally of Iran, would probably distance themselves insofar as you're now cozying yourself up, which probably counteracts many of the economic benefits of increased relationships with the West. So proud to negate.
Even the most ideologically driven leaders throughout history have certain shreds of humanity. And even if you didn't believe that the leadership of Iran had these shreds of humanity, you at least ought to believe that they were able to act in their own self-interest. They had entered into this deal before. They are able to enter into it again on better terms that protect them. Side Negative tells you that their protection route is nuclear weapons. We tell you it is so much more. It is economic power. It is power of the people in Iran to be enfranchised, both in terms of their economic success, but also their quality of life. These are all in the interests of this government that has the idea that they wish to have a legacy. They wish to have their son implemented in this country. We secure the future of that leadership. We help the people of Iran. We make it the strong country they so aimed to have. And that is why Side Affirmative is so far ahead in this debate. A couple of things in this speech. Firstly, some weighing. Secondly, why it is not actually the case that nuclear power is the best way to protect Iran. And then lastly, why you just got hugely increased political stability within that country. But just a note on weighing before I get into the responsive and substantive content within my speech. The first thing to say is that this is an interest debate. It is not an actor debate. Illogical interests from actors ought not be credited within this debate. Note this before I get into my material about nuclear power. The second thing is that at the point that you believe that the life of people in this government body improves materially, but also the fact that their assets improved materially. These weren't just the things that were dollars to them. These were the things like the people that worked for them, their support and their goodwill within that nation. These were all interests of that government, so much better on Side Affirmative. But firstly, why it was probably just not actually true that Iran needed nuclear weapons. What do we get from Side Negative? Side Negative tells us that they want to establish themselves as a regional power, and they want to be able to do things like force countries to stop sanctions because they have these nuclear weapons. I think that this is unlikely for a couple of reasons. If you are trying to deal in the game of nuclear weapons, Iran is already at a disadvantage, no matter what you do. This is super important in this debate because it meant that these nuclear weapons, you may be present, this tension was always going to be present, but you were not the most powerful in that Gulf region. The second thing to note is that the US will not budge on the grounds of things like nuclear weapons, but they're far more likely to budge when you have something that they want, you have something that they want, you have oil, you have stability guaranteed at the point that you enter into this deal. That is something that you want. That is why nuclear power was not actually the only way to stability for this country. Secondly, nuclear power is actually just not a legitimate interest in this debate. Note in my weighing that you must disregard things that are not actually, credible interest. The first thing to say is that nuclear power and the development of nuclear weapons and the development of that is incredibly expensive, but also very resource intensive. Note on Iran about nuclear weapons, they have a few kilograms of uranium that may be used for this. This is very expensive. The technology and the expertise are equally as expensive and difficult to acquire. And therefore, it is actually a far more difficult path than side negative actually outlined in this debate to make these nuclear weapons. The second thing is that this just led to increased aggression from Israel and the countries in the Gulf region. They were going to try and wipe you out at the point in which you developed these targets even more. It's made you a huger target. Note the conflicts on the Azeri border. And then the last thing is mutually assured destruction was not necessarily something that was beneficial in this debate. You obviously got way more allies when you entered into this deal. Notably, this was not just about the United States. It was about the European Union that entered into that first deal in 2015. It was also France, it was Germany, it was so many countries outside of the US. You obviously had so much more goodwill with these countries that was so useful to you. But why did the US actually just have an interest in entering into this agreement on your terms? They were able to fix the mistakes of the Trump administration, but they were also able to reduce a geopolitical liability. They were able to remove a hostile nuclear partner. This meant that you had a unique bargaining chip to the United States that you never had before. These deals are likely to be entered into on really good grounds for this Iranian leadership. The nuclear weapons here meant that you were able to do things like reduce tensions with Israel. Because notably, these weapons were not made to fight the United States. They were made in response to the tension with Israel at the point in which you are giving the United States and many very powerful countries in the world a utile benefit. That was the point, that they were not going to embolden Israel to attack you. They were not going to embolden further provocation. You obviously became much safer because Iran was not making nuclear weapons because they were fun and cool. It was because they felt unsafe. You feel far more safe when you have these countries on your side, something you never got on side negative. But let's actually talk about why you just had a way better time when you were these leaders. The first piece of context I want to emphasize here and note, I know in debating we love utilitarian arguments, but never underestimate the impact on people and how that affects the success of a country. Obviously, leaders want a successful country. Okay. Political stability is so essential for Iran's leadership, particularly with a history of people who are still facing issues of things like generational trauma from past inflammations of conflict. How did you get stability as this nation? Your main block was your population power. There are 85 million people in Iran, people that mattered. You were able to... In Iran, there was a huge risk to this government in the idea that when people were materially unhappy, the amount of protests and unrests you got and the upswing of opposition was likely to increase. Notably, after this deal has fallen through, there has been a greater frequency of these protests. What does rioting and dissatisfaction actually mean for this country? It means that there is immense suffering. But what does it look like on the ground in Iran? And this is a huge impact in the debate because it impacts real people's lives. Firstly, it is a horrible situation when you do not have access to food that you need, when you had issues with your population, when people were unable to have children to make a workforce. That meant that you had a population pyramid that was very difficult to go into an era where you needed economic prosperity and you needed safety and security in ways that went beyond what weapons you had in your arsenal. It was how your population felt, worked, and lived in the world. Firstly, on food. Obviously, when you have children and a population that are starving, They are unhappy and will likely not be particularly receptive when you try to put your son in as a leader. They are not going to be super happy with that. The second thing is economic prosperity. Because that nuke doesn't actually give you dollar amounts, what you actually got dollar amounts was from having that oil be able to be sold in a time that oil was so valuable. You were able to take some of that trade away from your enemies in that region. You were able to provide that asset to the rest of the world. So beneficial. But you also just got the support of your population. You had people that were happy and healthy, who could have a quality of life free from with prosperity. At the end of this, even if you did not believe that the leaders of Iran had a shred of humanity, you ought believe they cared that their population could work. You ought believe that they were safe from the retaliation of those in their area, but you also ought to believe that they were able to capitalize on this deal like never before and would never happen again. Incredibly proud to propose.
Interestingly, we get our easiest path to victory in this debate from First Affirmative. Because they get up and tell you that in Iran there exists a counterfactual government which is campaigning for association with the West and for progressivism. Note, that means that if the current government concedes that allying with the West is a good thing because we want to have trade with them, because we want to reduce sanctions, then necessarily concedes the imperative of your governmental opposition. That is to say that where currently your campaigning chip was that we hate the West, that for so long has historically fucked over our country, we stopped doing that, we start allying with the West, the margin of that parliament gets so much smaller, they are very likely to lose the election to someone that just allies with the West more. They had to stand by the thing that currently kept them in power, that was the fact that they were against the West, they defended the religious and international ideology. That was our easiest route to winning the debate. If they lost the next election, obviously that was the thing they cared about most. Beyond this, I will have two issues in this debate. Firstly, whether this is good for internal incentives. Secondly, whether this is good for external autonomy. What do we hear internally from opposition? The strongest push is basically about the idea that sanctions are a huge problem and they're likely to care about it for the fact that it leads to economic growth. First thing they say, right, is just that, first thing to say is that this is reasonably unresponsive to our material on why leaders don't actually care that much about it. They tell you it's millions of dollars, but we would note that, firstly, the governmental leaders who lose personal capital because of this, probably A, have a lot of money anyway, or B, and more likely, have the political capital that means that money just doesn't matter for you. If you had so much control over a country, why'd you care if you could afford things? You could probably get them other ways. That wasn't a particularly strong personal incentive. Because they tell you also that people don't care, because they were campaigning on the basis of being an ideologically strong government rather than the government allied with the West. That is to say that people didn't care about economics. But also, right, that opposition just massively mischaracterizes what Iran looks like. It is not incredibly impoverished. They have oil, as they tell you. Note they can trade with Russia. Also note that their current ally, Russia, has a lot of food. If it was true that that's the imperative of opposition, the US is actually kind of screwed for food security at the moment. We'd much rather trade with Russia, who can't trade with anyone else at the moment. That was presumably their best way to get food security, even if it was a problem, which it wasn't. But also, beyond this, we counterfactually tell you that having a nuclear arsenal is a good way to get aid and to make up for this. Because we tell you that when North Korea power projects and shows the West that it means business, they necessarily get aid to feed their populations. That was a good thing, but also because you could just develop your economy and your oil to trade to other partners like Russia. It was not necessarily true that the West was the only option, right? Next thing they tell you then is about accountability and the idea of domestic image. First thing they tell you, they basically characterize this world in which, patience is wearing thin over time with economic turmoil. But as I say in my intro, right, the problem with this is that they are campaigning against a progressive government. Obviously, if patience is really wearing that thin, this government's kind of screwed anyway. They may as well double down on the fact that they have the religious win, they have the ideological win. That was their only route to win in the election. The next thing they tell you, though, is that there is generational trauma, that people are having severe disadvantage, and that is likely to lead them to protest. The thing to note here is that the generational trauma that exists is literally the fault of the US, right? Because they instituted a series of US-backed government that completely fucked over the country, and now people hate the US and do not want the government to go back to it. That is to say, we co-opt their generational trauma benefit, because the populace literally hates the US. They do not want a government which just flips and literally goes begging to the US on its knees for more economic benefit. We tell you then this is literally so bad for domestic image. Obviously we want to care about it. At the end of that, We think that the only route to holding political power, and as the opposition says, putting the person's son in power, is to maintain the support of the people along ideological bases and along religious bases. Opposition needed to engage in that rather than just saying like, oh, people might get richer with a false imperative that the country wasn't even that bad. That being said, onto the second objective, and that is just to say that the country cares about having agency on an international scale. For the simple reason that we tell you at Oscar, this is a government who believes it has a divine right to control, that it wants to become a massive Islamic state and have a severe degree of power. So any mechanisms which actually gives them more agency to act in the way they want to and power project over other countries is obviously a good thing. Why does this happen? We tell you that the counterfactual is simply that they just keep producing nukes. And here is opposition's first pushback. And that's just to say that like, oh, developing nukes is actually really hard. First thing, literally all the material tell at Oscar, right? It's such an assertion just to say that developing nukes is hard. Countries have done it before, countries will do it again. We tell you that they were very close. We told you that America thought they were close, because why else would America make an agreement if they didn't think Iran developing nukes was a serious threat? And also, because we tell you that this probably looks like Iran becoming closer to Russia, note as that relationship strengthens, the speed with which they can develop nukes speeds up. We think it was very realistic that you could develop nukes quite quickly, especially in a country that was not as economically screwed up as they like to tell you. Next thing they tell you is that nukes themselves come with some external harms. They're going to hurt their agency. First claim they give you is it's going to exacerbate tension with Israel. The problem with this is that their pushback kind of just presumes that the US would back Iran in a war or in tension against Israel, which is obviously not true. If they are right and that Iran's like a current enemy in that sphere is Israel, then obviously the US is literally the worst option because Israel was massively backed by the US. They would never get the support they needed. Rather, they need to independently install nukes to have that symmetrical threat back to Israel to actually maintain power in the area. Second thing is they just tell you that generally it makes Iran a target. I think, firstly, in that region where there are a bunch of power-hungry states, presumably being vulnerable and reliant on other countries, which also themselves have competing interests in that area, actually makes you far more of a threat because it's ways that take you over. Note, this was probably an acceptable risk to take in the very short term because we ensure the power of the government for such a long time. Opposition wants to talk long term, we will talk long term as well. Next thing, though, is on economic agency. Now, Opposition tells you, right, that there is economic self-interest and the government on an agency perspective wants to have a strong economy. First thing they tell you is oh, we have economic power. So vague what this means, right? A government which has autocratic and note ideological power presumably has the political capital to actually operate with more agency. That is to say, you didn't have to scrounge up the budget to do something. You literally had the direct control of the country. People believed in your ideology, so you could tell them what to do. That looked like having more power. That was something the government probably cared about a lot. Second thing that they tell you is that the people in the country get better and they ought to care about this. No, we tell you down the bench that the primary incentive of this government is to stay in power, and because they genuinely believe that the way to best benefit the country is to reinstate a strong Islamic body. That was their interest. Unclear why specifically they care about the interests of the people in the country. Also note, even if this is the case, it's just so marginal, right? We tell you can ally with Russia. We tell you those economic incentives actually work quite well. Presumably Iran keeps developing anyway. Next thing, though, final thing then they tell you economically is this is going to lead to a massive immediate benefit when the currency evaluates. Firstly, the mechanism of this is just so painfully vague, right? They're just oh, if you sign a deal with the US, your currency is going to go up. First thing to note, we obviously do care more about your currency in relation to other things. For example, the ruble, that was not going to be affected on the opposition side. But secondly, if they literally get up and tell you that a country has no foreign exchange reserves, has no reserves of currency, that's just to say presumably they don't accrue as many benefits from this, right? If they don't have the money with which to bring in aid, that's not going to happen. We'd much rather the counterfactual whereby bodies like the UN are able to give them aid, are able to actually give you aid. Finally, though, they present the mechanism that is worth engaging with other actors in the international stage. That this will get rid of allies. This is literally bad for the government, right? This is a government that did not want to rely on countries like France and England, Germany, or whatever for their power. They wanted to have that alone. They wanted to be able to institute their ideology. A world in which they relied on nuclear protection from someone else was a unique harm I'm very, very proud to negate.
I'll note at the start of this speech that a debate that's judged on the interests of a government, benefits can only be won or lost if that government continues to exist to have interests in the first place. You do not get the benefits of power projection, you do not get the benefits of being a government that has a strong nuclear arsenal if you are not in government at all. that is material we bring you at Branko. We tell you that when the sun sets on Tehran and millions of people are starving and they take to the streets because they are galvanized by a faction that wants you ousted from power, that is something that threatens your interests as a government. We tell you that when your assets as an individual, one who is part of the ruling class, one who is very wealthy, are frozen in US-controlled financial institutions overseas, and they will not give them back to you unless you stop enriching the bloody uranium, that is something that threatens the interests of this government. It threatens their ability to stay in power, threatens their ability to exact any of their preferences on their population. It affects their ability to rule. It affects their ability to continue that power, which, note, is not done through elections per se. It's through a hereditary, like we're talking about a hereditary supreme leader. People who have the title supreme leader generally are not super democratic, as a general rule. We're talking about the continuation of this government. First, we're going to talk about nuclear weaponry, why it was an insane win condition for this team. Secondly, we're going to talk about what their actual interests are, how we better serve them. We would note, again, that nuclear weaponry only really matters as a benefit if you can retain the power that gives you beneficial access to it. But note, only really matters if you can even get this arsenal off the ground. And we tell you that it is not in the interest of Iran to become a nuclear power, nor is it particularly feasible for them to do so. Their I guess, Hail Mary response to this is like, well, if big bad Iran wasn't big bad Iran and didn't have a very solid chance of becoming a big bad nuclear power, why would the US apply sanctions to them? We note, one, the United States applies sanctions on a bunch of different countries that have far less capabilities than, for instance, Iran does, based on minimizing its geopolitical liabilities. Does not matter if they would not become a nuclear power in like the next year or so. The fact that they have enriched uranium, the fact that they are reneging on the terms of a deal that threatens the United States' legitimacy and chokehold on the entire region is a reason. We note that the United States also sanctions people and countries for purely ideological reasons. They sanction countries simply because they elect leftist governments. They coup countries because they do the same thing. It was not sufficient for this team to say that, well, clearly they must be very big and bad and scary because the United States sanctions them. The United States sanctions everyone. Firstly, then let's talk about why it's incredibly difficult to become a nuclear power. They claim that we just assert that it is very difficult to build up a nuclear arsenal. That is not true. Well, firstly, we tell you that it is extremely difficult building the weapons themselves. We tell you that Iran only has like tens of kilos of uranium that is sufficiently enriched. We note when we say sufficiently enriched, we mean beyond any appropriate civilian use, but still not yet to weapons-grade enrichment that they would need to build up a substantial arsenal, or even a few warheads. We tell you that that uranium is incredibly difficult to get on an international market. We note that much of the world's uranium exists in the mines of the allies of the West and the allies of the United States. Yes, they have been basically smuggled uranium by Russia. We note that Russia has a lot on its plate right now and is unlikely to continue to do this at the point at which it is not looking to, for instance, engage in massive hot war with the United States. We secondly tell you that it is incredibly difficult to build these things together, even if you have a lump of uranium. Tell you getting the expertise required into the country is incredibly difficult. Those people are captured by other countries that have legitimate, in the eyes of the West, nuclear programs. You simply cannot get them. They themselves will be sanctioned. They will not be allowed to return to their home countries. They will not come and help you, and they largely are not, which is why Iran's nuclear development has stalled pretty substantially. We tell you that thirdly, mutually assured destruction, MAD if you will, requires things like nuclear detection and deflection. That is to say, you need to detect that somebody is firing a nuke at you and fire one right back at them before you are completely flattened, and that is what will happen when you do not have incredibly sophisticated mechanisms. We would note like the Iron Dome in Israel is an excellent example of a detection and deflection system. Iran does not have this because it is incredibly expensive and time-consuming to build. We would note that you can't even keep the lights on for hours at night in Tehran at the moment. You cannot access food and water and basic necessities. You cannot access sanitation. That is an enormous opportunity cost that affects everyone, and it requires a massive amount of attention that is just insane to divert. Unclear that they can even afford to divert it in the first place. Tell you then that the build-up of this nuclear arsenal is extremely likely to fail, but that also we tell you, to very little response, that the attempts to build up a nuclear arsenal attract enormous amounts of aggression and attention from the precise people who you do not want to wipe you out, and they want to wipe you out, like for instance places like Israel. And no, it is not true that yes, the United States would back Iran in a conflict with Israel. They would obviously just use their leverage over Israel to stop them from being that aggressive with you, like in, for instance, Azerbaijani border conflicts that erupt in skirmishes pretty constantly. That's the kind of thing that we would do. That is why we tell you that allying with countries like the United States, who can provide with lots of sweet, sweet oil, a time when they really need a lot of sweet, sweet oil, is what is more likely to protect you from things like other nuclear powers like Israel, who you are ideologically and theologically opposed to. So, Nuclear arsenal, bad idea for Iran, likely to get them wiped off the map in the near future if they even try. They're not likely to succeed in the first instance. Let's secondly talk about what the actual interests of a country like Iran are in this debate. At first negative, they try and outframe this by saying, well, these are all unimportant compared to things like ideology and to projecting power. Firstly, on ideology. The countries are overwhelmingly not, and leaderships of those countries are not inflexible on this issue. There's an enormous public and private distinction in the way that they act and say. We'd note that for many years, while there was still trade in oil, in Iranian oil, that they would say domestically on the media that they control and the legitimate channels of government communication that they also control that the US is evil, that the West is ideologically and theologically corrupt, that they will all burn, and continue to sell them oil at the same time. Not to mention their own assets, which obviously the public are not even privy to the transactions of. We tell you that these people also have private interests as a leadership cohort. They would obviously not deliver this messaging in a bad way. And I would note how much of this team's analysis relies on them basically going, I'm the supreme leader of this country, and I would like to announce that we are cucks and we are listening to America. They will obviously not do it like that. They'll not say, yes, our political opposition are correct when they say that we should ally with America or that we should retain closer ties to the West. They will say, the US have unfrozen our assets. They are buying our oil again. They are the cucks, and we are mighty Iran. And that is something that they will say. Again, we tell you that they have a monopoly on media control. They have a chokehold on the legitimate government communication as, again, someone who bears the title of supreme leader, and that they have ideological control and theological control, which, yes, controls people's outcome far into the afterlife, if you want to read it that way. They have an enormous amount of influence. They will say, we have unfrozen $100 billion in US dollars of Iranian assets overseas. They are the ones who are weak. We are simply using them for their sweet, sweet oil money. That is not, they will never admit to being weak. It is unclear why dictators are not able to strongman as dictators will. They often do, even when their economies are failing. Though we tell you, importantly, progressive governments are weaponizing the effects of sanction and limiting their ability to do this. They're saying you cannot put rice on your table to feed your family. That is the fault of this government who stubbornly refuses to back off of this stupid nuclear program that isn't even going to work. They tell you the progressives do not want your son to ascend to supreme leader when you have retired. We tell you that progressives are also, to the extent that they care about ideology, ideologically distinct. Yes, they follow the same sect of Islam, but they have less fidelity to Islamic norms, that certainly less than this current relatively conservative government does. And that is something that you probably also care about. So we win that interest as well. Then, next, on projecting power. Projecting power can be done in a bunch of other ways, like, for instance, having economic strength and massively diversifying your internal economy, something that this conservative sect has expressed interest in doing. To tell you that cultural interests, which again can only happen when people are not starving, are also a massive point of power and pride. Lastly, then, on economic benefits. The current reserves within Iran are held within their currency, which has lost 90% of its value because of US sanctions. Same thing happened to Russia. This is obviously a legitimate mechanism of revaluing that currency. We tell you that you can sell a bunch of oil. We tell you that we can unfreeze the $100 billion of held assets overseas of these leaders personally. We obviously win this debate by a mile.
There is no path to them winning this debate. On quite clearly the biggest benefit that we get, which is that you get to power project, you get nuclear weapons, they have a series of responses that just do not disprove it, do not remotely engage with it. Even on the issue on which they do compete, the economy, it is first, less important. Second, we have a series of nearly unresponded to benefits about why it is actually worse for their power. And third, they have like one mech, which is trade deals. So when I take that down, they necessarily lose their whole benefit. First, on like whether or not they'll get nuclear weapons and why that's the biggest deal. Second, on the power of the Iranian regime. And third, if I get time, I'll talk about personal incentives and money, as if like the Ayatollah didn't have enough money in all of the Iranian treasury to fund whatever he wanted to do. Let's start with the issue of whether or not we'll get nuclear weapons. The first thing I want to flag here is that they have a response that this is an illegitimate interest. Panel, just ignore this. It's not clear why this is an illegitimate interest. This argument didn't make sense. Let's first get into why it is that they are likely to get nuclear weapons. We explain that this would stop them from getting nuclear weapons. That is not contested. You must accept in this debate that for the series of reasons we give, this would stop them from getting nuclear weapons. The thing that they do contest is whether or not nuclear weapons will actually be developed. We explain a couple of reasons that they will. The first is that they already have a nuclear weapons program that was well on its way. That's why the original deal happened. Secondly, we explain that they're supported by Russia, a nuclear power who would help them get nuclear weapons in order to counter what they see as the US proliferating nuclear weapons to its allies. And third, we explain that it is not that difficult. They respond in two ways. They say, first of all, it's expensive. Iran is a huge country with a huge budget. I'm sure it can afford it. The better response is to say that there is not enough uranium. We explain that you're able to get it from Russia. Like lots of the world's uranium is found in countries like Kazakhstan that Russia has direct access to. Their response is Russia has a lot on their plate. Like, I'm more than sure that the size of the Kremlin can manage to still talk to Iran at the same time as they're doing a war. That's a short-term interest anyway. And actually, the fact that Russia is becoming increasingly isolated works for us in this debate because it explains that Russia is more in need of allies now than ever, so it is likely to provide uranium. So, with those responses out of the way, we prove that Russia will be able to get nuclear weapons. The only question is then, is this likely to be in their interest? So, we explain that it would be incredibly good for three reasons. First, it would ensure their long-term regional stability. It would ensure that they could not have any aggression against them. That aggression could come in two forms. First, Western or US intervention in the Middle East, as they've shown they have a history of doing, or secondly, insofar as aggression might come from the proxy war that they currently have with Saudi Arabia. Maybe this is not something that is imminent, but note that the development of nuclear weapons protects them over long timescales, for the next 50, 100 years, where these things certainly are plausible. The second thing we explain is that you're able to try and extract concessions from other states when you have nuclear weapons. You can do things like test your nuclear weapons or make nuclear threats in order to try and bring states to the bargaining table to get more aid or to get the lifting of sanctions. And we point to the fact that North Korea does this all the time, right? They show off their nuclear capability in order to try and get sanctions, and has been very, very successful in the past. The third thing we explain is that it allows them to massively power project, which is a good in and of itself because of the way that the Ayatollah's incentives are, which is to say that he believes that Iran ought be a great Islamic power. They say you can power project in other ways, e.g. by having a good economy, but obviously it's a very different form of power projection, like we made some mobile phones in a factory versus I can like destroy your whole country at the press of a button. Very different forms of power projection. How do they respond? First, they explain that you might get attacked if you have nuclear weapons. Seems unlikely someone's going to invade you when they have nuclear weapons. Second, they say it's going to ease the tensions with Israel. First, unlikely you're going to ease the tensions in Israel. Like Iran doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. That harm is probably maximized. And secondly, it's not clear that Iran's interests are with peace in Israel, right? Like, Iran doesn't like Israel. It's not clear that that's something that matters. The third thing they explain is that the US will not budge. First of all, I would note that this is no mechanistic response, right? They don't actually explain why the US wouldn't budge. It's a kind of like a plausibility check that they don't feel it would happen, but it's probably hard given that we give you examples of where the US has done this in the past. Their final response is to say that mutually assured destruction does not work. Because like you would need monitoring systems to see that you were getting nuked. Like, this is just unresponsive to our mechanism. Our mechanism isn't like you're going to not get nuked. Our mechanism is you're going to be able to power project. Our mechanism is you're going to protect yourself from other forms of potential invasion. Like, that was never our argument. Completely missed our argument. So why is this the most important? Why is this the most important issue in the debate? First, I'd note that long term we co-opt their economic benefits. So even if the economy is the thing that they care about, we still win. Second, we note that this is in line with the ideological goals of the Ayatollah. The primary one, like the Ayatollah is an incredibly religious man, and their response is that he's flexible on the ideology as he has been in the past. First, the fact that he has previously had to be flexible on the ideology doesn't indicate that he doesn't hold that ideology. And secondly, they say here that you can lie about that ideology, but clearly in this case you cannot lie about that ideology. Like, people are going to know that this happened, so that's not relevant. The final reason that this is incredible is this is the most important issue in the debate, is that the only other issue is about how much control does the Ayatollah have in Iran, and we would suggest that there just isn't a particular threat to the Ayatollah in Iran. First, we would note that their characterization of Iran as like starving and everyone in the streets is just not true. Second, we note they have a lot of oil, and that allows them to keep their economy quite well afloat. And third, support for the Ayatollah and his regime in Iran is quite high. There's, for instance, lots of religious institutions who have like religious police who will go around and shut down any dissent. That means that their only harm, which is like the Ayatollah potentially losing power, does not carry. Therefore, necessarily, the fact that they will get nuclear weapons is the biggest issue in the debate, and we must necessarily win. Let's next look at the Ayatollah's power. We first give you a series of reasons that this would be incredibly bad for the Ayatollah's power, because the Ayatollah would be seen as weak for going back to the US. They say that no, the Ayatollah is going to frame it differently, maybe, but it's quite clear what happened. Like, they did go back, they did get cucked by the US. It doesn't matter how you try and frame it. They also say, well, the Ayatollah is going to be able to control inside Iran the way that this narrative happens, note, when they're responding to our arguments about the way in which this is bad for the Ayatollah's power, they explain to you that there isn't a threat to the Ayatollah's power, that the Ayatollah has a lot of power. So obviously that is a concession that it isn't likely that the Ayatollah is going to get overthrown. The second reason we tell you it's bad for your image domestically is that you're seen to be cozying up to the West, and there's a lot of anti-US sentiment in Iran for the reason that the US has historically screwed over Iran, done things like meddle in their government and install leaders who sold off their state assets to the US and screwed over the country. And the third thing we tell you about why it's bad for their image is that they're seen to be giving up on sovereignty. They're allowing things like US inspectors inside their country to look at it. The fact that there was no response to that means even if they get their economic harms, we probably still come up in this issue. Now let's look at their economic harms. They make a lot of impacts here, like a weird stuff about currency, but there's really one claim, which is the lifting of trade sanctions, right? So 6 responses. First, note that the impact of this is like a threat to their power. So if you don't believe that this would be the tipping point that leads to the Ayatollah getting taken down, it has no impact. Secondly, I'd note that there is a lot of trade currently between Iran and Russia, and that means that they don't have such an issue with the kind of trade that they're talking about. Third, I'd note that trade deals only work if there would be trade between those two nations. But even if the sanctions that prevented trade went away, I would suggest that there would not be a lot of trade between Iran and the US because individual firms in those two countries have antipathy towards each other and therefore would not choose to engage. Fourth, we explain that Russia is probably less happy with you, so any trade that you gain on the US, Russia gets less, so therefore it's zero-sum. Fifthly, I'd explain that this is likely to be a bad deal because we are going back to them, which puts us in a very poor bargaining position, and that means that you're probably not going to get all of the sanctions lifted. Sixthly, I'd explain that the Ayatollah does not want Western goods coming into Iran. The Ayatollah wants Iran to be an Islamic country and sees the fact that Western companies like McDonald's coming in is taking away from the character of the country that he wants. They say people are sad and want things. The Ayatollah doesn't want them to be living a consumerist Western lifestyle. He wants them to be living an Islamic lifestyle, and that means it is not actually in his interest that all these Western consumer goods pour into Iran.